Good afternoon and welcome to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration's webinar series to discuss infant formula food ingredients and packaging requirements. I'm Lieutenant Commander Janisha Robbs with the FDA's Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, Communications and Public Engagement staff, and I will serve as your moderator. Today's webinar will focus on regulatory requirements and considerations for infant formula packaging. The FDA plays a critical role in ensuring the safety and nutritional adequacy of infant formula in the United States. The FDA also works to ensure that infant formula sold in the United States meets the required safety and nutritional standards specified in Section 412 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and in the FDA's implementing regulations at 21 CFR Parts 106 and 107. The webinars in this series are part of the FDA's ongoing efforts to help improve the safety and resiliency of the U.S. infant formula supply and provide educational resources for infant formula manufacturers. In a moment, I will turn the call over to Dr. Patricia Hansen, Deputy Director of CFSAN's Office of Nutrition and Food Labeling, to provide opening remarks. Then you will hear from Dr. Jessica Herbalis, Regulatory Review Scientist in CFSAN's Office of Food Additive Safety, Division of Food Contact Substances, to provide information on U.S. regulation of food contact substances and considerations for infant formula. After the presentation, we will move to the question and answer portion of the webinar, where Dr. Herbalis will answer questions we received through the registration process. With that, I will now turn the call over to Dr. Patricia Hansen, Deputy Director of CFSAN's Office of Nutrition and Food Labeling.
Thank you, Janisha, and welcome back for many, to the sixth webinar in this series. In this webinar, Dr. Jessica Herbalis, a chemist and regulatory review scientist in the Office of Food Additive Safety, will provide you with important information on FDA's requirements and recommendations regarding infant formula packaging information. As I've mentioned in the previous webinars, the requirements for new infant formula submissions are the same, whether a manufacturer and its products are eligible to pursue the path outlined in our Infant Formula Transition Plan guidance, published in September of 2022, or a manufacturer is making a new infant formula submission through our regular established process. This includes the packaging requirements. Now, in the second webinar of this series, Dr. Carrie Assar provided an overview of the entire landscape of FDA's new infant formula submission requirements and our recommendations, including packaging. You might find it helpful to review that webinar again as a refresher after this one today. Today, Dr. Herbalis will take us on a deeper dive into FDA's requirements and recommendations regarding infant formula packaging, including some very important legal and regulatory context on food packaging and food contact materials generally. Now, we hope that all of you, regardless of the pathway you may be on and whatever your role may be in the process, will find this core information helpful. The information in this webinar may be especially useful to those involved in product development, materials procurement, and regulatory affairs. And now to turn things over to Dr. Herbalis.
Thank you, Dr. Hansen, for that introduction, and thank you all for joining us today. As Dr. Hansen just mentioned, the goal of today's talk is to discuss how food contact substances in the U.S. are regulated and considerations for infant formula packaging. But first, I will provide some background on the history and legal basis for FDA's authority of food contact substances, and then discuss how a manufacturer can determine if their material is authorized for its specific intended use. Afterwards, we turn the focus to infant formula packaging and an overview of the information that we recommend to include in an infant formula notification in order for FDA to confirm that all components of the packaging or food contact material are authorized for their intended use. So to begin, food safety is one of the responsibilities of the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, or CFSAN. The Office of Food Additive Safety is tasked with ensuring the safety of substances added to food and food contact materials. And while there is some overlap in cross-divisional work, the vast majority of food additives that are directly added to food are evaluated by the Division of Food Ingredients, while indirect food additives are evaluated by the Division of Food Contact Substances. As this symposium is focused on infant formula, we can simplify these distinctions to say that the Division of Food Ingredients evaluates infant formula ingredients, while the Division of Food Contact Substances evaluates substances used in infant formula packaging and other materials that contact infant formula. If you have any questions regarding infant formula ingredients, I would encourage you to consult the webinar conducted by my colleague, Dr. Rachel Morissette, who gave an overview of the regulations and recommendations for infant formula ingredients. As for today, we will focus on food contact materials and their use in infant formula packaging. To understand how FDA looks at food additives, it might be helpful to understand a bit of our history and authorities. In 1938, Congress passed the original Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. This act included some food provisions, particularly as it relates to food adulteration. However, the Food Additives Amendment passed in 1958 provided FDA with the authority over food additives. The amendment formally defined a food additive and created the Food Additive Petition process for sponsors to petition FDA for pre-market authorization of new uses of food additives. The amendment also established the standard of safety for food additives, which says the food additives are automatically unsafe unless they're used in a way that FDA has authorized, and the food containing the unauthorized additive is deemed adulterated. The FDA Modernization Act was later passed in 1997, and this act defined a subset of food additives called food contact substances. It also created a pre-market notification process called Food Contact Substance Notifications, or FCNs, that allowed for more expedited review of these types of substances compared to the food additive petition process. So what makes something a food additive? The legal definition says all substances, the intended use of which results or may be reasonably be expected to result, directly or indirectly, in their becoming a component of food or otherwise affecting the characteristics of any food. Food additives require pre-market authorization for their use, which is evaluated through the Food Additive Petition process and regulated by Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR. As I previously mentioned, the FDA Modernization Act also defined a food contact substance, or FCS, which is any substance intended for use as a component of materials used in the manufacturing, packing, packaging, transporting, or holding food if such use is not intended to have any technical effect in such food. Food contact substances that are expected to become a component of food under its conditions of use also require pre-market authorization, and they are primarily evaluated through a Food Contact Substance Notification, or FCN. Contrary to the listings in the CFR, effective FCNs are manufacturer-specific, and therefore only authorize a substance and its intended use for the manufacturer or supplier listed in the notification. FDA reviews FCSs as individual components of food contact articles, meaning the review is not for whole packaging or whole products. Some examples of food contact substances are monomers in a polymer, or polymer itself, or different kinds of additives such as colorants and antioxidants. But what does that all mean in the context of food packaging? We consider food packaging to be one type of food contact article, which is made up of food contact materials. These are materials that contact food, such as coatings, adhesives, polymers, or paperboard. In addition to food packaging, food contact materials include those used in food processing, such as lubricants and conveyor belts, or other articles intended to hold or transport food. Because food contact materials are made up of food contact substances, The regulatory status of a food contact material is based on the regulatory status of each individual component that comprises the material. In this context, the regulatory status is the means by which that substance is authorized for its specific intended use. As stated in 21 CFR 106.40b, any substance used in packaging material for infant formula that is reasonably expected to become a component of food as a result of its intended use must be authorized or exempt for its intended use by one or more of the following: a food additive regulation, an issued threshold of regulation or TOR exemption, have generally recognized as safe or GRAS status, be prior sanctioned, or the subject of an effective FCN. I will provide additional detail on several of these in a moment, but first, the intended use is important to note here. For example, just because a substance is authorized for use by a food additive regulation in paperboard packaging does not also mean that it is authorized for use in polyolefin films. In addition, the regulatory status of a food contact article is dictated by the most restrictive component of the article. For instance, if most components are authorized for use under conditions of use A through H, but one component is limited to condition of use C through H, the final article can only be used based on the more restrictive limitation of conditions of use C through H. Now, as I mentioned previously, the food additive regulations are established in response to food additive petitions. Food additives, including food contact substances, are listed in 21 CFR Parts 170 to 189. The authorizations stated in the regulations are applicable to all manufacturers, provided that the substance and its use complies with the regulation. For example, the regulation may include criteria on the identity of the substance, such as the CAS reg number, specific molecular weight, starting material, or ratio of monomers, as well as end tests to demonstrate compliance. Regulations may state specific conditions of use for the substance, such as its function or its use level. The regulation may also provide for specifications with respect to use of the substance in a material in contact with certain food types, or time and temperature limitations. A food contact substance may also be exempt from regulation as a food additive by an issued threshold of regulation or TOR exemption. Like food additive regulations, TOR exemptions are also applicable to all manufacturers or suppliers, provided that the substance meets the intended use in any limitation stated in the exemption. There are several criteria listed for a TOR exemption, and they are listed in 21 CFR 170.39. Most notably, that the dietary exposure of the substance resulting from its intended use is below 0.5 parts per billion, and the FCS itself is not a known carcinogen. FDA review of TOR exemption submissions may be completed in less than 120 days. And issued TOR exemptions are listed in an inventory on our website for your consultation. Our website has a similar inventory for effective FCNs. Unlike food additive regulations or TOR exemptions, FCNs are manufacturer-specific, meaning that they are only effective for the manufacturer or supplier listed in the FCN, and are only effective for the specific substance and intended use described in the notification. There is also a statutory 120-day review timeframe for FCNs. The listings for effective FCNs are similar to those for issued TOR exemptions in that they specify the substance, intended use, and any limitations or specifications for its use. However, FCNs also include the effective date and the name of the manufacturer or supplier for which the FCN is effective. It's important to note that the standard of safety is the same for food additive regulations and FCNs. The standard is based on safety only, meaning there is no risk-benefit analysis conducted for the use of a substance. Instead, it requires a reasonable certainty of no harm in the minds of competent scientists under its conditions of use. It does not and cannot require proof beyond any possible doubt that no harm will result under any conceivable circumstance. Built into this reasonable certainty of no harm is the Delaney Clause, which does not allow for the authorization of a food additive with known carcinogenicity in humans or animals. The assessment of safety is based primarily on two joining factors. It is dependent on the dietary exposure of the substance, and that in turn is determined by the intended use of the substance. How the FDA assesses the safety of an FCS is by evaluating consumer dietary exposure to the substance from its intended use and ensuring that the probable dietary exposures are supported by available toxicological information. In simplistic terms, we often use the rubric that the intended use of the FCS may generally be considered safe if the cumulative EDI is less than the ADI. The ADI, or acceptable daily intake, is the estimate of the amount of an FCS that may be consumed daily over a lifetime with reasonable certainty of no harm. The ADI value of a substance is determined from robust toxicological data. The estimated daily intake, or EDI, is calculated by estimating the amount of an FCS that may be consumed daily by an individual from its intended uses. To estimate the EDI, we first need to determine how much of the FCS may migrate to the food under its intended conditions of use. To do so, we review the amount of migration of the substance from the packaging or other article into the food itself. Notifiers may conduct migration studies under conditions that reflect intended use to provide estimates of the highest probable migration levels of the FCS or other components into food. The amount of migration is reported in relation to the food contact surface area, and migration values are calculated using the amount of food in the packaging to determine concentrations or levels of the FCS in the food, such as microgram of FCS per kilogram of food. The migration levels in food obtained from either migration data, as previously discussed, or a 100% migration calculation are then used to calculate consumer dietary exposure to the FCS and all of its impurities and breakdown products. When an FCS is used in single-use food packaging, calculations may be refined using packaging information. The packaging information includes packaging factors such as food type distribution factor and a consumption factor. These factors answer the questions of how much of each food type will contact the food contact article, and how much of the daily diet will contact the food contact article. The combination of the packaging information and the migration levels leads to the consumer dietary exposure estimates for the specific use of the FCS in packaging. Now, as a note, for an FCS intended for use in infant formula packaging, we do not include packaging factors in the dietary exposure estimate because we assume the infant formula is the sole source of the infant's diet and not a fraction thereof. And when calculating dietary exposure for infants in an FCN submission, there are additional safety factors in place. Infants aged 0 to 6 months typically consume human milk and/or infant formula exclusively and consume higher amounts of food in relation to their body weight than adults. This contributes to a higher, albeit temporarily limited, exposure to potential migrants from the FCS. For this reason, as well as the known differences in metabolism between infants and the adult population, FDA published a guidance document in 2014 that describes the specific information needed in an FCN submission to calculate and support the dietary exposure estimates for the infant population. For example, the guidance describes the recommended simulants of 10x for powder or 50% ethanol for liquids to mimic migration of an FCS used in an article that is intended to contact infant formula or human milk. This includes articles such as packaging or baby bottles and nipples. The guidance also provides additional information regarding how to calculate the resulting dietary exposure estimates using values of body weight and food consumption that are specific to the infant population. So now that we've covered how the safety of food contact substances are evaluated by FDA, we can now transition to information specific to food contact substances used in infant formula packaging. For the remainder of the talk, we will discuss the type of information we recommend to support the packaging component of an infant formula notification, or IFN, how to determine if your food contact material is authorized for its intended use, and how to submit this information to FDA for review. Let's first start with what type of packaging information is reviewed in an infant formula notification. I will go into these categories in greater detail, but as an overview, the packaging information of an IFN should cover 3 main points. The first of which is a summary of the packaging information or other food contact article. This can mean a list of all components of the packaging material that are subject of the IFN. Second, identity and regulatory status information. This section should contain information to certify that each component is authorized for its specific intended use. It may include declarations of compliance from the manufacturers used for each material. And third, in the case where the IFN is not for completely new packaging, but rather for a change in packaging, a summary of any proposed changes should be clearly stated and accompanied by any relevant supporting information for the proposed change. The summary of packaging information may include a description of the packaging and all packaging materials that are the subject of the IFN. Meaning, if this is a submission for a new infant formula or a formula with new packaging, the description should include all components of the packaging in a comprehensive depiction. For example, a composite can would include the components of the can, all liners, adhesives, lid, and scoop. Multi-layer materials should also have clear descriptions as to the order of its layers, such as which is the food contact side and whether there is the presence of any functional barrier, such as aluminum. If the IFN is not for new packaging, but rather for a change in a component of previously reviewed packaging material, this summary would only need to focus on the new component of material that is the subject of the notification. As infant formula is packaged in various forms, it is also important to provide the intended use of the materials. For example, is the material in contact with dry or liquid infant formula, and is it used at room temperature or sterilized at high temperature conditions? There may also be instances where other types of food contact articles may be included. For example, materials used in transport, storage, or holding the infant formula. Once you have the list of all the food contact materials that are subject of the IFN, the next step is to provide the identity and regulatory status of each substance that makes up that material. When we say regulatory status, it essentially means describe how the substance is authorized for its specific intended use in your food contact article. Each substance should meet the specifications of a regulation for its identity and use, or be authorized or exempt from pre-market authorization by either an issued TOR exemption, be considered GRAS for the intended use, be prior sanctioned, or subject of an effective FCN. One way to provide this information is using a declaration of compliance from the manufacturer of the material. Declarations of compliance are manufacturer specific because an FCS may be authorized according to specific identity and intended use limitations, both of which may be varied between manufacturing processes. As an example, here's the type of information that supports the proposed use of a blue scoop in infant formula packaging. The information provided should include the identity of each substance that comprises the scoop, including the chemical name and CAS reg number, its intended use in the scoop, such as for use as a colorant or stabilizer, and reference to the corresponding food additive regulation or other means such as the number of an effective FCN that authorizes that substance for that specific intended use in the article. The key concept for these submissions is that every food contact substance used in infant formula packaging must be authorized or be exempt for its specific intended use. That is to say, an infant formula notification is not the appropriate avenue to obtain authorization for use of a food contact substance. So what if you determine that your packaging contains an unauthorized FCS? Then you may need to submit an FCN for pre-market authorization. An FCN is needed for a new FCS, or if the specific intended use of the substance is not authorized by one of the means listed previously. In addition, if the FCS is the subject of an effective SCN, a new FCN may be needed if the FCS is from a different manufacturer or supplier, if there is a new intended use of the FCS, or a change in its manufacture, impurity profile, or dietary exposure estimate resulting from its intended use. If you have any questions about whether your substance is authorized for its intended use, or questions regarding FCN submissions, we encourage you to contact the Division of Food Contact Substances here at FDA. As I mentioned before, there may be instances where a full dossier of the packaging components is not necessary to include in an IFN. If the IFN includes a packaging change to material previously reviewed by FDA for the same infant formula manufacturer, a summary of the packaging changes may be sufficient. In order to avoid duplicative review, the IFN does not need to include all of the identity and regulatory information of the complete packaging, but rather just the information pertaining to the specific change requested. This type of information may include a summary of the changes proposed in the submission. For instance, a change in the material used in an article of the packaging, or a change in a component of that article, such as a new resin, colorant, or new grade of an existing material. In support of the proposed change, additional information may be needed, namely declarations of compliance from manufacturers, new identity information, intended use and regulatory status, and a scientific rationale for the change when applicable. Lastly, reference to previous IFNs for which the other components of the packaging were reviewed should be included to demonstrate the additional review is not needed for these materials. Let's go through another example. In this instance, there is a proposed change to the colorant used in the polymer lid. The packaging information should therefore include the chemical identity of the substance, both old and new, the intended use, and the corresponding regulatory status. A description of the change would include the summary of the proposed change and clarify that no other changes are to be implemented in either the lid or other components of the packaging. Included are references to the IFN number where the lid was previously reviewed, as well as the IFN number or numbers where the rest of the packaging was reviewed. This enables us to quickly verify that all components were previously reviewed by FDA and allows us to focus our review on the proposed change in the subject notification. So now that we've gone through what information is pertinent to the packaging review of an IFN, it may be helpful to show you the different ways that this information may be submitted to FDA. Most packaging information is submitted to FDA by the infant formula manufacturer as part of the IFN submission itself. If a packaging material manufacturer prefers to send identity information of their components directly to FDA for review, they may do so by submitting to OFAS a Food Master File, or FMF, through CIFSAN's online submission module, or COSM. Alternatively, information may be submitted via paper or CD-ROM directly to our address in Maryland. As a note, FDA does not accept submissions on USB drive. Across all of these avenues, we request any information provided to OFAS in support of an infant formula notification include the corresponding number of the submission so that we are able to ensure all supporting information is properly identified. We also offer different ways to provide regulatory support to our stakeholders. If you have a general question regarding an FCS or its regulatory status, you may submit an inquiry to us at our pre-market inbox. Additionally, many questions may be answered by our website at how to determine the regulatory status of a food additive. However, if you would like to request more in-depth assistance regarding packaging information for an infant formula notification or a future FCN, you may do so by requesting a PNC, or pre-notification consultation, in which we would be able to conduct a pre-review or provide more tailored guidance for your future submission. In addition to those avenues of support, we also have a lot of information on our website pertaining to food contact substances, the different ways they can be authorized for their use, information for FCN submissions, and the use of recycled plastics in food packaging. These links shown here will hopefully be helpful tools if you have questions regarding the topics discussed today. Of course, if you have any additional questions not answered in these resources, please don't hesitate to contact us by one of the means listed previously. Lastly, I would like to thank you all for your time and attention and for joining us today to discuss infant formula packaging.
Thank you, Dr. Herbalist. At this time, we will begin the question and answer portion of the webinar and answer several of the questions we received during the webinar registration process. Our first question is, can you confirm that food contact substances listed in the 21 CFR food additive regulations, for example, polymers, adhesives, coatings, may be used for infant formula packaging?
Yes, these regulations authorize the safe use of these substances in contact with infant formula in accordance with any limitation or specification stated in the regulation. The exception to this, of course, is when regulations list limitations for the use of a substance in contact with specific food types. For example, a food contact substance may be limited to its use in contact with alcoholic foods, thereby excluding its use in contact with infant formula.
Can you explain the bisphenol A or BPA restriction for use in infant formula packaging?
In 2013, FDA amended its regulations to no longer provide authorization for the use of BPA-based epoxy resins as coatings and packaging for infant formula. Similarly, in 2012, FDA amended its regulations to no longer provide for the use of BPA-based polycarbonate resins in baby bottles and sippy cups. Both of these actions were taken in response to food additive petitions, which demonstrated that the use of these BPA resins in such articles have been abandoned. As such, because there is no current authorized use of BPA-based epoxy resins in infant formula packaging, any manufacturer who seeks to use this resin in the future would need to obtain pre-market authorization to demonstrate safety for its intended use. And this would be the same process for any other new food contact substance.
What are the requirements for infant formula packaging that is a multi-layer structure without a functional barrier?
A food contact substance may reasonably be expected to migrate to food from a multi-layer structure under its intended conditions of use in the absence of a functional barrier. For example, a metal foil layer. Therefore, in the absence of a functional barrier, all components of the multi-layer structure must be authorized for their intended use.
All right, and our last question, is there an optimized format for submitting packaging information?
There is no standard approach or specific form to submit to FDA for infant formula packaging information. However, our recommendation is to provide clear and concise submissions containing a summary of the materials subject to the review and clear descriptions of the identity of the substance, its intended use, and the corresponding U.S. regulation or other authorization for that specific intended use. We understand that a substance may be authorized for many different intended uses, and declarations of compliance from suppliers often cite multiple regulations. However, providing only the applicable authorization for the specific intended use of the substance in the packaging or article helps expedite our review. This type of information may be submitted by the infant formula manufacturer or directly from the packaging material supplier as a food master file, as discussed earlier in the webinar.
We received additional questions that were specified to a regulation or an experimental method. We encourage stakeholders to submit these questions to us at pre-market, PREMARKT, at fda.hhs.gov so that we may provide more individualized responses to better assist. Thank you to Dr. Hansen and thank you, Dr. Herbalist. Links to resources that were shared during today's presentation are also available in the YouTube description box below. This concludes today's webinar. A recording will be available on FDA's meeting webpage shortly. Thank you and have a great day.